December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
That is, of course, the president 80 years ago, Franklin D. Roosevelt, talking about the attack in Hawaii by the Japanese Empire, smashing planes and kamikaze pilots into our service members, sparking World War II. And my question for you now at 217-629-7970 is, do Americans remember history? We know 9/11 happened back in 2001. I don't know if younger people might say exactly the year it happened, but it's still pretty fresh in our consciousness, in our collective consciousness. But what about World War II and what really seemed to spark at least America's involvement in that? Pearl Harbor, on this day 80 years ago. Think about that. 80 years ago on this day, the attack in Hawaii from the Empire of Japan woke up America as a sleeping giant, getting us into World War II. And I think it's important for us to reflect upon not just what happened on this day 80 years ago, but also to reflect upon what World War II was about and just how transformative that was for the entire globe. I talked about this briefly earlier this morning, and I'd love to hear your thoughts at 217-629-7970. Again, 217-629-7970. I'm reading this book called The Fourth Turning. It's generational theory from a couple of academics, one being Neil Strauss, or Neil Howe, I believe. Strauss Howe are the authors who put this book together. And I'm kind of bouncing around. I've got some general understanding of the themes of the book and also their kind of definitions and whatnot. But what they postulate here is that Western society has gone through 80-year cycles, what they call seculums, and it's 80 to 80 plus years. It's not an exact, but they say every 80 or so years there are a lot of tumult. There's a lot of turmoil that happens, and generational conflicts all throughout the 80-year seculum are pretty evident, they highlight. And these are academics delving into generational theory, and they highlight how one turning, they call, of a generational turning was the American Revolution. And then 80 years later, the generations turned, and then you had the U.S. Civil War. And then 80 years later, the generations turned, and then you have World War II. That was 80 years ago that we started in World War II with Pearl Harbor. Again, awakening the sleeping giant of America. So here we are now, 80 years later, and you look at what have we dealt with? A Trump presidency that was chaotic. We got COVID-19 rocking the world. You've got tens of thousands of people all around the globe that are taking to the streets to protest COVID protocols that are limiting their freedom. There are people in Australia being put into camps, quarantine camps, and people taking to the streets in countries all around the globe protesting a limiting of their freedom. But what happened 80 years ago? That have we forgotten? Have we forgotten what World War II was and the atrocities that have happened back in World War II 80 years ago, where the images that were coming out of the camps that the Nazi Germany put together and the experiments that they were doing on people? I mean, it brought us the Nuremberg Code, for example, which one of the chief principles in that, again, stemming from our work as a country 80 years ago, post Pearl Harbor, getting into World War II, one of the chief things about the Nuremberg Code was you can't experiment on people without their consent. And I think that these types of worldwide awakenings, obvious with World War II, as our involvement in that led to a spreading of individual liberty and also a proliferation of some kind of self-governance. But here we are 80 years later. Have we let that memory fade? Good morning. You're on WMAY.
Yes, we're talking. We got in the war in 41. But my father-in-law, and I'll give his name, Sheldon Buell, got in 39. He got in as an engineer, and he was in Lincoln, Nebraska. At that time, they knew something could happen. So as soon as they hit the Pearl Harbor, he was sent to Tinian Island.
Yep.
Now, my husband was born in 43. I guess he got sent in 43, right after 41, and then he got sent. They built the field in they built the field in Tinian Island to start the A bombs. That's where the A bombs went off. You know, the field. The airplanes took off. 2 of them had the bombs. I think 6 of them did not have bombs, but they all took off together.
Yeah.
But they had to prepare the field at night because they used coral from the sea because they couldn't have shifts because the Japanese would know what was going on. So this actually started in Germany in 39.
Right, and there was a lot. There was a lot of word around the world that Germany was doing some atrocious things, and Americans weren't willing to get involved in it, especially after World War I. We were definitely war weary, but Pearl Harbor on this day, 80 years ago, really woke up that sleeping giant.
Right, because we was prepared if something happened. Americans will always had the military to prepare, knowing something. We wasn't at Tinian Island after 41, nothing like that. But as soon as it happened, we was prepared to build an airfield and to make sure our country was safe.
Well, let me ask you a question. In the years you've been on this planet, have you seen our society kind of forget about the importance of?
I think we have forgot, and I would think it wouldn't. I don't think we'd have a war like we did in World War II. We've seen Vietnam War, the poisons and stuff. I think this one would be a much quicker war.
Well, we'll see what
we
happens.
Have more nuclear. I don't think we would be in it for 4 years.
Well, and will it be a war of weapons, or will it be a war of words? I mean, because you see how much social media and how much corporate media is trying to craft opinion and trying to shape and mold opinion, and it's effective to a degree, but it'll be interesting.
It's effective. The words are effective, but you still, if we had a war from another country, then we will have to have the military nuclear war. Yeah. And words does not have the nuclear money to put that in effect.
Well, I appreciate you chiming in and sharing your thoughts on this, and I want to hear from more of you. 217-629-7970, 80 years after Pearl Harbor and the moment where it awoke the sleeping giant of America to get into World War II, to hold Japan accountable, to hold the Germans accountable. Even as was mentioned there, it slipped my mind for whatever reason, we used 2 nuclear bombs to end that war. Have we forgotten history to the degree of understanding why we got into this and understanding some of the major outcomes from the West's victory in World War II, spreading the idea of freedom, spreading the idea of self-governance, and pushing against tyrannical governments that are taking people's freedoms away? Have we slipped away from that understanding? Good morning.
Yeah, my grandfather's brother, Frank Reagan, was on board the USS Schley, one of the old 4-stackers. He was in a slip there opposite of Battleship Row on the at Pearl Harbor when he was stationed there. He'd injured his hand and was at the hospital on the base when the attack occurred. And then he was helping with the wounded and the dying, and a Japanese bomb picked him up and threw him about 90 feet head first into a brick building.
Oh, man.
And then he was unconscious on board the hospital ship from Hawaii all the way to St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., where they finally worked on his head. One of the plates on his head had crossed over the other and was constricting his brain. He came out of the coma, but he was discharged from the Navy. And he spent 33 years at Danville Soldiers and Sailors. He sleeps out at Camp Butler.
Rest in peace. That's for sure.
Seaman First Class Frank Reagan.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing. It is the WMAY morning news feed, 217-629-7970. Good morning.
Yeah, I would hate to see what would happen if America ever had to get involved in a war like we did back in World War II. Back in World War II, there was no real mandates, but people were asked to ration, sugar and gas,
Right. Yeah,
and rubber and metal, and fabrics and different things for the cause.
They took over factories to get the war implements built and
I'm
did the
just talking
Defense
about
Production
the common.
Act.
Yeah, I'm just talking about the common person, not factories. Just a common
I
person was
understand.
asked
Yeah.
to, ration gas, ration everything. They quit making cars, like you said. So I would hate to see what would happen today because we can't even get people to wear a mask. So I could imagine asking these people, hey, give up your rubber tires or your, I don't know, your metal or your sugar for a week or two, or hey, you can only drive so far because gas has been. I would hate to see how people would act today. So
I don't know. I think that there would be an evaluation of people to, make their determination themselves. And I think that that's what you see right now. You've
we're
got
in a
people who
me
determine,
society.
but you've got people who determine, you know what, I'm going to put a mask on. I feel that myself is safest for myself and for others. Other people might not feel the same way, or they evaluated it differently, right? But I think if you saw something of a global threat, the likes of Nazis or the likes of the Japanese Empire, that has a way to solidify things rather than the politicization of COVID-19 that we've seen in the past
I would
2
hope
years.
so, but I doubt
listen, I hope so too, right?
Right.
Appreciate the
Hope
call.
so.
It's now 8:23. Got to take a break, but I appreciate everybody chiming in on that. Now, let's look at that forecast where you've got a high